Here we are. Happy hour, everybody. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I am Deb Philman, and I have with me today Frank from Chalkboard Heresy. I'm
Hey,
so lucky to have an actual teacher, you guys. He's a teacher. He's a history teacher, even better.
thank
And
you.
yeah, so Frank, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do? How are you, by the way? How are you doing?
Doing good.
Good.
Doing well. Just,
Okay.
hanging out, waiting
Good.
for school to start. So,
Are you waiting like
weeks.
with trepidation, or are you like a little bit morbidly excited?
I think there's a little bit of both. I feel I'm prepared to handle it, and
Yeah.
we'll see. It's going to be interesting what happens.
Mhm.
Maybe uneventful, maybe very eventful.
Right.
I'm a little ready to get back into the swing of the school year routines after, especially, we were closed down for, over a year or so.
Yeah. So that's got to be odd. I mean, so first, before we kind of dive into that, like bring the audience up to speed on who you are, where you teach, your age range, the age of the kids, and then your background and so forth.
Sure. Well, I'm a history and education major. I've taught about 10 years now. I teach in a city called Waukegan, which is in northern Illinois. It's about, 45 minutes, an hour north of Chicago. And I've taught 10 years. I teach U.S. history now, but I've kind of been a jack of all trades, teaching world history and economics, poli-sci, geography, sociology, you name it.
Mhm.
Uh, so that's a little bit about my experience. And, I could talk a little bit more about what I started and why, if you'd like me to.
Yeah, I do because I just so you know how I found you, I was reaching out to Lily Tang Williams.
Okay,
And
sure.
she's so busy. This woman is a dynamo. She's all over the country talking to
Yeah.
everybody. And I mean, on a mission, really. And we're so
Mm.
grateful for her. But she said, you need to talk to Frank. You need to talk to my friend Frank from Chalkboard Heresy and, get him on your show. I said, absolutely. And I had seen some of your posts. So I already had kind of been introduced to the fact that you were out there,
Sure.
but it was relatively recently and I didn't know anyone who knew you. And I mean, sometimes I reach out to people just like, hey, you don't know me, come on my show. But it was really nice. It was nice to be able to have somebody say, he's my friend, go talk to him. And then when I saw your website, I I felt like you were in my head. I was reading the things that you guys, if you don't know his website, it's actually Chalkboard Heresy. I think, are you at .com?
Dot
Chalkboard Heresy.
com.
Right. Let me write it down for you guys because you need to go and you need to, follow his website. He's also got a YouTube channel by the same name. And so I found that and I was reading it and I just thought to myself, it's like you were talking like through my, but I'm not a teacher. So the only difference, I mean, I was a long time ago, ironically in Winnetka, but it was just like somebody gets it, who's also currently in the classroom. And I mentioned to you before we started that for a lot of people, you're like a unicorn, somebody who's currently teaching, who's in like a unionized state, right?
Mhm.
But who's just 100% against this. It's not even, you're not even like halfway, right? You're just all in against. So now tell everybody, when did you first, become aware that this was just off the rails to crazy town and you had to do something?
I think, since I started 10 years ago, immediately it was a different reality in education. And it was shocking. I had a lot of these concerns and thoughts for a while, and one of my posts, I kind of talk about that, the toll it took on me and the experience. When did I decide to really start with this? I think about a year ago, summer of 2020, when there was violence in American streets, statues of Washington and Lincoln being torn down and fire set. I started to become really concerned as a historian, seeing this kind of as a preview of what may come
Mm-hmm.
on a larger scale. And
Mm-hmm.
I started to think about where was this coming from. And obviously there's, the narrative as well, that there's this oppressive police state and there's white supremacy. And this is the reason. And I was really surprised by a number of my colleagues defending what was happening. And I actually I'll have to share it at some point. Someone from Twitter wrote every administrator that I'm connected to, my superintendent, accusing me of being a dangerous white supremacist. I was a danger to the children and all this stuff. And for the first time, I didn't back down. I kind of said, what, this is too far. And I started to think, what can I do? And I was just sitting and thinking on this. And when the conversation started to go national, and also what I observed happening in my own district, I felt that this was a time I had to make a decision. I could be quiet or I could speak out, and I chose to speak out. I know there's risks. I know there may be consequences, but I don't feel I have as much of a choice as people think. I don't think being quiet is an option anymore.
Now tell us more about that, because I feel the same as you. But again, you're in a much more risky position than I am right now. I've made myself somewhat unemployable, but I also haven't been trying to teach in the classroom.
Sure.
So, I have private students for tutoring and so forth. But in your situation, you're putting your career at risk, an ongoing career right now.
Yeah. It's something I've thought a lot about. Sometimes there's trepidation. I guess I measure that against the greater risks that I see occurring socially. I think about my family. I think about my son. I think about my students and the type of world they are going to inherit and be responsible for. Mm-hmm. And I do worry about the social fragmentation that may occur in this country as a result of this.
Right.
I worry about the unintended consequences. And that, I think, is really what has motivated me to do this. I also think there are so many problems inherent in the public education system that someone had to also address those as well. I've seen the toll it's taken on children. I've seen the toll it's taken on teachers. As I said, I write about that. I've become a vocal kind of advocate for school choice. And I tell you, I'm really thinking a lot about, even this idea of, kind of abolishing public education as we know it and allowing something else to come in its place, as we have in our, most areas of our life. We have choice, we have opportunities, because I think there's a consequence to it, not just on the students, but also on adults too, my colleagues.
Well, it's a monopoly, and and it's a government monopoly, so it's really antithetical to what our country's supposed to be.
Sure.
Even if you believe in, safety nets, for example, I've had people say to me, but what do you do about foster children? What do you do about homeless children? What do you do about, these all the exceptions, right? And I understand that point because, every kid needs an education. But we've gone from something that could potentially be a safety net for those kids that don't have some other option, with lots and lots of competition in the private sector where people could choose to sponsor these kids. People could choose to bring them into their private school on a scholarship or, whatever. And we've gone from that potentiality to, nope, we, the government, are going to do it. We're going to do all of it. We're going to feed them their meals. We're going to take care of their psychological needs, their medical needs, you name it. We're going to parent these children. And the problem is 90% of them have parents already.
Yes.
And so you've kind of taken free people, Americans, okay, and even people who live here, who have children going to school here, and you've said, you don't have this option. You're sort of conscripted into our system unless you take extra steps to get out of it and prove to us you've gotten out of it in an appropriate manner, but we're keeping the money anyway. Too bad, so sad. Which it just doesn't feel like it goes with our democracy, as they call it, or,
Sure.
A free people. It doesn't feel like self-determination at all to me.
I agree. I've noticed schools are increasingly taking on things I don't think they were designed to handle. I don't think they have the resources or the capability, and they always want more and more money to do these things.
That they volunteered to do.
Right, that they volunteered to do. I mean, even, this idea of feeding children. And I hear this a lot where, how will our kids eat? I said, how will our kids eat? First of all, that's not the function of a school. That's a parent function, but it gives too much power to the school. Like, people have this idea, I think it's a false idea, that without these things, that society would fall into chaos and children wouldn't eat and they wouldn't learn. And I just reject that, because in so many other areas of our life, private services fill those needs. And I'm for public funding, but I'm for having that money, that public money, however you want to divide it amongst people. You do it on a state level, people get equal vouchers, let them make those decisions. They know what's best for their children. And I think too, if it were more effective, I wouldn't have as much of a problem with it. I mean, that's the irony, is when people tell me about, well, look at all we do. And I say, yeah, it barely even works.
You do I would say it doesn't work. I mean,
the
results are in, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the irony, though, to me, is that we say things like, well, I wouldn't be opposed to it if it worked, but the problem is the method is the madness. In other words, it doesn't work because it is what it is kind of how I look at it. So it's designed not to work. And I don't mean that I do think there are some people way back who intentionally designed it to limit how much people would think for themselves and how much people would know. But those, big-hearted, well-intentioned people today, I don't think are walking and going, let's design a system that fails. I think it's just the nature of the beast at this point, that it was created on the Prussian model, which was not designed for independent thinking, was not designed to have each individual reach their individual potential. It's just not how a uniform basic education is going to function. And when you say we take all comers and we'll do all things, and you have a right to that, in other words, everybody has a right to free and appropriate public education. Well, now the government gets to find what appropriate is. You don't. They do. And you can say, well, my child tests for this and needs that, needs the other. But at some point, the government still is the one writing all those rules. Like saying, just like with healthcare, you have Medicare, right? Because I have Medicare, it's great. Then how come so many people buy supplemental insurance?
Right.
Because it's not good enough for them. Same with school.
We're also limited by our imagination. In the sense, I kind of think of us, we're like the Soviet citizens who have only known government grocery stores, government rations. We can't imagine something outside of that. And when the Soviet Union fell, and many of these people who had never been exposed to the Western world stepped foot in a grocery store, you talk to them, they just couldn't believe it. It was the choice, the abundance. And I think we're very much in that same way. We can't imagine something outside of it. And I think that's unfortunate, because if you're creative, you could start to think about the possibilities. Now, I don't know what the answer is. People will sometimes say, well, what's your answer? What's your solution? That's the point. I'm not smart enough to centrally plan a system to educate everyone in the way they need. I know that other people are, and that we would figure it out as we do with other things.
Right.
And so that's really the point, is that no one can do this through central planning and central organization.
And you probably should be suspicious of the people who say they can.
Absolutely.
And so, the question I ask parents is, when they say, well, what's your solution? I say, well, why are you asking me? Or why are you asking anyone else other than you what the solution is for your child? Sure. Now, if they want to be specific and say, how do I get my money back? In other words, like, what can I do legislatively to try to angle to get that money back if I've paid property taxes for this thing I don't think is adequate? That's a separate conversation. Sure. But if you're saying, how do I solve the problem of getting my child an education? You're going to have to be a lot more specific than that. Ask, you need to decide what you think is appropriate. And to your point before of lack of imagination, people have probably at this point went to these schools. They were brought up to believe they would be there. It's kind of like Social Security. It'll be there, that it will be there for them. And not just that it would be there, but that it was the right thing. So there was sort of a values component of like, if you don't support the public schools, somehow you're like a bad person, right? You're not a good citizen if you don't support this. Right. And the second thing is, you're not an expert, mom and dad. These people are trained teachers. And that is the nut that I keep, hammering away at trying to crack, because I want people to understand you taught your child to walk and talk and eat with a spoon and drink out of a cup and, like go to the bathroom and, they don't see that as a big deal, but it actually is.
Mhm.
The amount of brain power it takes to do the tasks of just speaking coherently. And if you have a decent vocabulary by the time you're 3 years old, I mean, your parents contributed to that. They don't realize it because it's sort of automatic. But I think with just a little bit of effort, you're doing reading, and then now you're doing math. Now, no, maybe calculus is out of your reach. Okay. But for that beginning level, I think, or you want to ask parents like, well, how did you find your job? How did you buy your house or rent your apartment or buy your car, or right? And if you could do those things, if you figured that out, you can figure out how to get your child an education, because it's not any more difficult, right? It's about figuring out, what are my requirements? Who might provide the thing that meets those requirements? Go out and search. And with the internet, oh my God, right? So, but I agree with you. I think they've just been kind of lulled into believing, or sometimes bullied into believing, you don't know what's best. We do, you don't. We're the experts, let us do our job.
Right. And I'm very skeptical of people in education that call themselves experts, because there's so much flimsy science, so much, the methodology from which they conduct these studies. I mean, I've heard so much about this study, and this study tells this. And you look at these studies and they're, qualitative, small, there's no control groups. They talk about data a lot, but I don't think they fully understand, how to really gather and collect data, how to use it. And a lot of times it doesn't say what they think it does. And the questions of how they got it are very questionable.
Well, and then you find out, if you follow the money all the way back, you find the union in some of the cases.
Sure.
Or you find, an interested party at a university that just so happens to be selling a curriculum or something. The other thing that is awfully convenient is their current theology, their current dogma, tells them that qualitative data is superior. Did you not know? I mean, quantitative, that's so white.
Yeah. It's, there's something so crazy about that argument. It's really insulting when you think about it, when they talk about it as something that's exclusive to whiteness, that whites, the scientific method and empiricism, as if it's inaccessible to Black people, to Hispanics. I mean, that to me is just so condescending.
And so much for true history. Remember, they said all we want to do is teach true history. And I'm like, well, can we have a little chat about the not white people who contributed to these fields of study for hundreds of years and more and longer? Like,
sure. And what gets me is that, as a historian, this idea of taking this kind of current model of whiteness and what is white and applying it onto the past, they say, well, that was white people. White people, that wasn't a concept that's meaningful when you're looking at 17th, 18th century Europe. These were distinct peoples that did not see themselves. I mean, that's the history of Europe. Look at World War I. No one was getting together and saying, hey, we're all white. We're all on the same page. They were strong ethnic nationalists that saw their ethnicities, being Anglo, as different from being Irish as people today see Black and white. And
and they don't teach that context. See, you as a historian, you've studied that, and you've studied the context. You've studied European history. You've probably studied ancient history. And what concerns me about how they're teaching history now, through this lens, this critical theory lens, is they're dropping all context. Mm-hmm. People like Nicole Hannah-Jones, brag about their history major and how they didn't touch Western European history at all. She's like, oh, I'm very proud of the fact that I didn't study any of these colonial powers. And I'm like, then you don't understand your own subject matter. You can't write about the revolution. You can't write about the Atlantic slave trade. You can't write about any of this coherently if you didn't study any of that. And certainly to brag about it sounds utterly ridiculous. But hello, there's a curriculum, a Pulitzer Prize, and the kids are being taught this as fact. It's disturbing.
Yeah, my biggest issue is, as a historian, is the lack of understanding of the historical way of thinking, historical methodology by these people that are talking about teaching history. I got into an argument once, and someone was talking about, well, we only study Native American history through the European lens. And I said, that's because we don't have a history until that point of the Native Americans. And they said, "What? How dare you?" And I said, "No, history begins with written records. That is the classical understanding. It's not an insult. It's not to be degrading. There are many people throughout history who have been pre-literate. My own ancestors. When the Romans got there, the Irish, they were, or the Celts, they were like the backwater people of Europe, and we have to rely on the Roman records. So a lot of our understanding of what we'd call prehistorical people comes from archaeology and anthropology, and it's not that we intentionally ignore this. It's not like there's a treasure trove of writing that accounts for their lives from Native authors that we have just chosen to ignore. It's that historians have to work with what we have available. Mm-hmm. And we are aware of where these sources come from and that they're written from specific lenses, but we also take the historical context into account. That is so critical. It seems every day I'm arguing with people who are taking a modern 21st century lens and applying it onto a time period that it just doesn't apply.
Right. And the oral tradition is not the same.
It's not.
It's just not. I mean, we know there's an oral tradition of storytelling in Irish and Celtic culture, and as rich and beautiful as it is, as entertaining as it can be and all that, it is not factual. We cannot say with any degree of certainty that it represents what actually happened. Sure. Because what people choose to retell in narrative, as we know now in the 21st century, narrative is narrative. And narrative very often has very little to do with, like, if I were there, I could have videotaped it truth. And so children who are learning about history, I think, need to be told the truth. They need to be told this is narrative, this is oral history, and this is history. And there's a difference. And here's what the difference is. And this is why we go by this kind of record and not this kind of record. As you said, it's not an insult. It's not to say that this, isn't something you should ever read. Just don't think this tells you what happened. Right. Sure. And that's not what they're doing. They're showing there are different ways of knowing and different ways of storytelling. And they're not equal. That's the point. They're not equal.
Right. Well, and it's insulting when people say, to me, they say, well, of course you're defending that because you're white. And this, I don't identify with the Anglos of the 18th century. And to assume that because we shared a skin color, that those are my people. And my people, if you look at I'm really into my family ancestry, my cultural heritage, were oppressed under the Anglos. My grandmother is from Australia, and she had to hide the fact that she was Catholic. She was, you talk about systemic and systematic discrimination, couldn't apply to certain jobs because she was Irish Catholic. I had Jewish family members who their records in our family were lost because it wasn't something you talked about. So to assume that I share this commonality with them, because again, this is my problem with their approach to history, critical race theory's approach to history. It's not just history. And I think it's disingenuous to say that. It's taking a very specific lens and it's applying it to the past. Mm-hmm. And it's doing so using our present mindset. And that's the essence of what it means to be ahistorical, when you take the lens of the present and use it on the past.
Right. And you said something in one of your videos, I think it might have been like the first one that you did, not the real short one, but then there was like a 15-minute one where you were just kind of riffing it and stuff. And this is when when I was watching this, I remember thinking, God, that's such a good point. Where you were asking questions, you were having a conversation with some guy named Tom.
Yes.
And I wanted you to tell the audience a little bit about that conversation. Like, who was Tom? Where did this conversation take place? Was this a colleague? And then, because I think he was being ahistorical, like you're describing. And I think it's a great little anecdote to explain and contextualize like what you're talking about in real time with another teacher, right? Is this somebody you work with or that you know through teaching? Oh.
This is a colleague, and it was at our local teachers' Facebook group, and it was something that I felt was the nature of the discussion and how it unfolded was very revealing. It was in response to our school district renamed Thomas Jefferson Middle School, and there wasn't really a conversation or discussion on that. I have my own belief on that based on what I've studied and what I've read and learned. And I'm not discounting that there aren't other arguments. I just don't happen to accept them based on my understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of where the conversation came from.
Right. I like the fact that you brought up, you took one potential view of, Jefferson's, in the sense that, if you are this 18th century slave owning man, okay, property owner, etc., and you have these slaves and people are saying, why didn't he free them? Why didn't he set them free? And you made the point to do what? To run away to where? Like, where are they going and what are they doing? And then even if he had freed them, so to speak, there are certain responsibilities he had to them he wouldn't have had if they were free. There are things they would have to do if they were free, and other people would have to respect their freedom. There are myriad considerations that you have to put yourself in his shoes to understand. You can't just say from your 21st century point of view, well, I would have done X, because you really don't know what you would have done. You weren't there. You're not him. And to hold him accountable for not doing what you would do in 2021 seems a bit unfair.
Yeah, that was my point. It's, they keep wanting to make this about morals. Well, what would look, what at this point, what does it matter? I mean, there's no way to making a moral judgment from the comfort of our lives on someone at this time period. I personally would look to his accomplishments dealing with slavery, how he limited it legislatively. Doesn't mean that you can look at that he had slaves and say that's hypocritical, and okay, that may be fair, but let's also look at the time he was in. It was illegal in Virginia to free slaves. So what would he have done?
Right.
And I compared it. The best kind of comparison I made was to Oskar Schindler. I mean, and maybe we're not too far off from this point where someone's going to say Oskar Schindler employed Jewish slave laborers, and he did, but he was a human being working within the confines of his society and his time, and he did it to save their lives. I'm not saying that was Jefferson's motivation, but I'm saying that there's more complexity to the argument than I think the way it's been framed. And I think specifically related to my school district's decision to change the name, it was done very quickly. It was done during the pandemic. There was very little discussion, and some of it was dishonest. The claims that it's indisputable based on DNA evidence that he was the father and that he raped Sally Hemings, that's actually disputed. And there's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that that's not the case, that that's a myth, that it may, there's dissenting historical opinions on that. And so I think I would have been more able to accept their decision if there had been a debate, if there had been multiple sides brought into this. But it was just decided, this is who he is and this is what happened, and we're changing the name, and before people could even digest it. And there was no room for disagreement. It was just like, yeah, Jefferson did this. That's it. Terrible person. And people didn't even, the amount of ignorance, people didn't even know about his abolitionist stance, and the material things he did were, maybe it was a little exaggeration, but I said, he was really, America's first abolitionist in the sense of being a new country, and the material effects he had on the slave industry to stifle it, to limit it, and to just ignore that.
Well, let's face it. We know people don't talk about this enough, in my opinion. The phrase "all men are created equal" in and of itself was revolutionary. Go through human history, go as far back as you want to go. It's not even in the Bible, okay? It's not there. It was a completely novel concept. And to put that to paper, I mean, aside from all the other treason they were committing, okay, there is a Virginia planter who not only owns slaves, but as you pointed out, legally has to keep them. I mean, he can't just free them. I mean, he can sell them, but he can't free them. And he is now making a statement that is immediately, as you said, hypocritical, but we have to assume on some level he knew that. Now, whether or not he knew it and meant it as much as we would wish that he did, it was obviously up for debate, but he still wrote it. And it was still, even if he didn't intend to include Black people, it was still for white people, still for Europeans. It was still a revolutionary concept. You had a culture that dealt in indentured servitude, serfdom, all kinds of things for millennia. I mean, and it was still going on all over Europe, in Ireland in particular, all the way through the 1800s. So, to make a statement like that was like, what?
Right.
I'm sorry, what? And I don't think we get that across to students enough in this country, that the revolution wasn't just about the guns and the fighting. It was in the words. It began in the words. And the fact that they had to take up arms was to defend the words. That happened first when they put it down on paper, in my opinion. And so I think that's why I would have, that's one of the reasons I would have defended the name, is that you don't take this person and erase everything he did for the country because personally he had failings, or because he personally couldn't live up to all his hopes and dreams and aspirations in his lifetime. Lots of us, I mean, who amongst us can say that we have been able to live up to our aspirational goals and values every day of our lives?
Right.
I mean, I think of myself as a parent. Okay, like this is what it would be to be a good parent, and then I yell at my kids, right? Or like I do something and I have to lose my cool or whatever. And I think that's not in keeping with my values. But I slipped up. I did it. Okay, now that in that case, that's accidental, maybe. But as you pointed out, he was living in the confines of his time period. So it's I don't know. I just think that this is something that needs to be talked about more.
Absolutely.
And pushed more. So.
Look at, I brought this up in the conversation, but look at the refugee and the detention camps on the southern border. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not making this argument, but many people make the argument that these are literal modern day concentration camps, and we are going to be heavily judged by the people of the future for our inaction or for what we've done. And so I asked them, I said, okay, how will you be judged? What have you done? Well, I vote and I, make my opinion. No, very good. You're telling me that there's concentration camps on the southern border and you have not gone down with guns to liberate these people?
Wait, you voted for the guy who's keeping them there?
Right. I mean, yeah. Well, that's a totally other different right? argument. But yeah. So people from the future could very well judge us. You were sitting around watching Netflix and debating on Facebook while this tragedy of humanity was happening on the southern border. But I don't judge them by that, because I understand that these are people and they have families and they have realities of their lives. And you do something like that and there's consequences. So you may say, yeah, and and many times we benefit from, illegal immigration, whether it's, restaurants and the price of food we pay, or we benefit from literal slave labor in China. And mm-hmm. we are all in some ways bound by our circumstances of our time. And that's true today. It was true 100 years ago, 200, 300 years ago. And as you said, Jefferson's words were revolutionary then. They were revolutionary for the 20th century when you had racial science. People don't understand this. They said, well, look at what Jefferson said about black people. And I said, well, look at what people were saying about ethnic minorities in Europe, where they were measuring Irish skulls and looking at their brain size and determining
Jews.
And Jude. I mean, hello, and to say back then, even if he was just speaking about white males, to say that we were all born equal, wow, 200 years ahead of his time.
Very much so. And, also thousands of years leaping thousands of years from where everybody in the world was. Yeah. So, I've made this point on the channel before that George Washington technically had more in common with Julius Caesar than with Abraham Lincoln. And, people started to go, huh? And it's like, think about it. Just stop and think about it for a second. And then think about the Wright brothers, and they take off at Kitty Hawk in, what was it, 1903, I think, something like that. And then when did we put a man on the moon? Right. I mean, that's less than one person's lifetime. You got somebody who's barely qualifying for the senior discount at Denny's, and they've watched the Wright brothers and the moon landing. So that's tremendous. And yet, if you look at, you go from George Washington, go back the same 61, 62 years, whatever it is. And no, Not as much difference. Some difference in the fashions, but they're still traveling by, horse and buggy. They're still treating medical problems the same way with leeches. And there's, even today, I was listening to a documentary about a woman who had in Europe who had 17 children, none of whom survived.
Wow.
And, this was in the 17th century, but right before, somebody like Washington was born. And there was, smallpox died. I mean, when we think about why didn't they do this and why didn't they do that, and they were probably just trying to stay alive. I mean, I'm just saying, most people were trying to survive. Because although you can go to, Colonial Williamsburg and it looks all nice and clean and everything's fabulous, most people didn't live past 30. So
Yeah.
it's a completely different mindset, and it just seems wrong the way people are holding everyone accountable to live up to standards that, quite frankly, they don't live up to now.
Well, let's be honest. This is, really about making ourselves feel good. And, I like to paint this picture in people's heads. If you got someone who's wearing clothes probably made by someone who is making, $1 a day, and they're sitting on their iPhone on a comfy couch, and they're, texting, writing on Facebook, yes, I would have freed all the, I mean, that's a child's argument. That's something you encounter with children, when we were in second grade and they'd ask you, what would you do about, this issue in the rainforest? I'd free all the animals, and I would, tell the loggers to stop logging, and you just do it. You just say it, you just do it.
It does sound like a child. It does sound like something like a 6-year-old would say, right?
Of course it does, right?
Yeah. And, now I do have one question as a teacher. Sure. Another concern that I have is about literacy. Now, you're in high school. So at this point, the kids should be reading, but I know we've had some dismal results nationally as far as that goes. But my big concern, aside from what they're trying to teach, is that the students are not equipped to challenge it. They're not even equipped to really learn it in the traditional sense. Jordan made the point back up in here. He said, and I know he corrected something, he said would help, but teaching kids how to do history would also help, okay? Instead of just what is history, since that involves many judgment calls. So in other words, if they had to do a history or had to do that. And my question then would be, how many students are academically capable of some of the things they would need to do to make a meaningful challenge to what's going on? And I don't mean to denigrate their capabilities, their cognitive abilities. That's not what I'm saying. I think many students have been miseducated. So whether it's how they were taught to read in elementary years or how they were taught to write in middle school. And so by the time they come to you in high school, they may feel like writing is about meeting a word count or regurgitating what they think the teacher wants to hear. And the idea of thinking critically or asking questions or challenging the teacher and saying, wait a second, what? Where'd you get that? It's just foreign. At this point, they're just like, I got to get through this 45 minutes and what do they want? What's going to be on the test? Okay. And that's not scholarship. That's not even academic learning. That's kind of just indoctrination straight up.
Sure.
Because of abilities in terms of your ability to learn is sort of predicated on what you were taught as far as the tools of the trade. Am I hitting anything? Or is it like, would you agree? Would you not agree? Or
yeah, I think that one of the we do need to really teach students how to do history, how to think as historians. I actually think, to the credit of, speaking very personally in my district, in my department, that is something we have discussed a lot and really made an effort to do.
Well, that's good.
But there are also a lot of realities too, where we are also asked to get through a lot of content, and we are asked to do so much. It's almost mind-boggling. So you stop and you say, okay, we're going to teach students how to do history, and that could take several weeks on one little unit and one area of focus. I think it's worth it. I think if you try to do everything, you end up doing nothing, and the students don't remember it anyway. I'd rather spend more time teaching them how to think critically, having them look at primary sources, having them learn how to think about primary sources, and so forth.
Right.
And I've done that before, like with Christopher Columbus. You know, a lot of times the interpretation they get of Columbus is that he was a mass murderer and he was a rapist and he committed genocide. And I ask students, I said, let's look at the primary sources we have available.
Mm-hmm.
And they're sometimes surprised because they have these preconceptions about Columbus. And we get out all the primary sources. I say, let's look. And they, well, I can't find any account of him murdering anyone. I can find an account of, you know, him getting into conflict with this tribe or his group of men. He was not very good at colonial governance, but, you know, then they start to ask, well, where do we get these ideas? I said, it's a good question. Where do we get these ideas? Let's look at Howard Zinn. Let's read his.
Do we have to?
We look at Howard Zinn, and I said, you know, does he cite some of his statements? Well, no. And he uses secondary sources. So that's really great history. But again, you run against ideology, and some people don't like that. So the very people talking about true history, and you say, okay, let's do true history, they don't like sometimes what comes out of that. And you have to be prepared in history to just face it. And and the accusations people make, they say, well, you don't want to teach about Tulsa and what really happened. Who says I don't want to? You know, they build a straw man.
Right?
When have I ever said that? They
and
said,
when did we not? I learned about it. When did we not? We've been teaching about it.
If anything, the fact that we don't always talk about these things is not because we exclude Black history. If anything, we spend quite a bit of time on it. It's because, you know, we've got, you know, 4 or 5 days sometimes in a curriculum guide. It'll say do World War I in 4 or 5 days. So you've got this monumental event of 4 or 5 days, and they'll pick these events throughout history. Well, what about this? What about this? What about this? Well, you know, you could teach a whole course on, you know, a 10, 20-year period. I don't think we necessarily know what we're doing, but they're always going to be able to find criticisms that I think are a lot of times unfair to teachers too.
Yeah, very much
I've never said, because I didn't learn about, you know, went through my whole life not knowing about the Irish potato famine, which was a really big event, affected American history in terms of immigration. I don't think it was a purposeful thing. I understand the teacher just was making a judgment call that right now I got to get through the Civil War. I got to do, you know, Reconstruction and, you know, all the Gilded Age, and they're just running through things. So we need to re-examine scope and coverage
right
as well.
And I think if you teach, to your point, if you teach how to think about history, which I would put in the doing history component, you know, of it, then the kids have the tools to learn about those things on their own. Mm-hmm. You know, and might be more inclined to, because I always found history more interesting when I was taught how complicated it was. So when it was just a series of dates and places and things like that, I found it boring. I was like, oh God, I have to memorize these dates. Once it became more about understanding a time period, and why different people living in the same time period chose to do different things and what happened, suddenly it became more like a really interesting novel, only true. You know, it's like time travel, if you will. The only way I was ever going to time travel was going to be to learn more about history, and suddenly it became really interesting. So I think the way that it's taught in most classrooms, obviously not yours, but it's not accessible. It's not very interesting. And that's how they get stuck in you didn't teach this event and that event and the other event. And how would you choose? Right. But I do want to go back to Christopher Columbus really quickly.
Sure.
In addition to this sort of presentism that they bring to history, the woke, I think they forget, and it's ironic because they're such ideological people, mm-hmm. that people in the past were ideological too. So let's take Christopher Columbus as an example. He was a Catholic, and he was a devout Catholic, and the king and queen who sent him on this mission were devout Catholics. And he went on a mission for gold and treasure and so forth, but also it was considered at the time a priority to convert people, to make sure that the world was safe for Christendom or whatever. Okay. And so there are writings of his, diaries of his, that talk about he was going to save these natives, right? And, bring them to Catholicism, and be like, what a horrible thing. And he colonized their minds, and okay, what are you doing actually, right now? in the school. I mean, and I know they would deny that it's a religion, although I think it's kind of got some religious overtones. But my point is more ideological or philosophical. The same people will tell you there's one truth or one right way to look at history or one right way to look in with critical theory, one right way to look at race or whatever. We'll look at Christopher Columbus, who said there's one right way to look at the world, and it's called Catholicism, and judge him today for that, when at the time he was as committed and as convicted that he was doing something good for people. Like he was sort of the woke of that period of the 1400s,
absolutely.
that he believed he was awakening them to the truth, right?
Absolutely.
For his time, 100%. He thought he was saving their souls. And that, people think, well, that's just whatever they want to think it is now. And like, no, it's important that you realize he really did believe that. And you can't go from now to then and judge him unless you want however many hundreds of years hence to be likewise judged. Okay. Right. And that's, to your point about, remembering what's going on, but that's one I wanted to point out, because Columbus falls right in that space of, he had convictions, he had beliefs. You don't have to agree with them, but he had them.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
It wasn't I'm just going to do this because I want to.
Right. But the narrative is, that he was a racist and he was a mass murderer. Never mind that, I think, Jared Diamond and, anthropologists kind of estimated that, upwards of maybe 95% of people died from disease. But that's somehow lost in the argument, or that's their fault.
Well, yes, it's their fault. They should have, they who had no concept of microbiology should have known that they were going from one environment to another and bringing an invasive virus or invasive bacteria. Really.
Isn't it funny that the same people who say, if you blame China in any way for COVID, anyway, you are a racist, want to blame Columbus for, at a time before they knew what germs were, how they were carried, you want to blame him for that. I mean, they still thought the plague was a result of demonic possession.
I mean, they didn't understand rats and fleas and no concept of any of this. And the other thing is that, can we have a little chat about syphilis? Should we talk about syphilis? How it got brought back to Europe?
Right.
So, I mean, this is what happens when humans move around the globe at a time when they, as you said, don't understand germs or anything. And, there's that book, was it Guns, Germs, and Steel?
Sure.
And that's an interesting read, because that's one perspective on, how important those things were. Another thing I saw was relative to the, why was it people from Northern Europe, Northwestern Europe were doing all this exploring? Why wasn't this happening in the Southern Hemisphere? Why weren't other people? The North Star would probably have something to do with it. If you can't find your way home,
sure.
You're not going to venture too far from home in a boat. Even if you are a seafaring people, if you don't have the first, like a fixed point to get home. And if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, you don't have that. So it could be something as simple as that. It's not a value judgment. It's just the way things were. And it took longer before, you had to have a compass. You had to have other things before people from all over the world could do that. And so, and also from China. Okay, they were exploring like crazy from China. Now, I'm always interested in how did they venture so far south and still get back to China, but they must have had their ways. So, I guess, what are you going to do? Like, as a practical matter, you said, you're just going to go in and if they come to you and say, you got to do, or do they give you a choice? Do you get to choose your curriculum? How does it work for you?
We actually have in the past had a fair amount of freedom. There's the official curriculum, but there's a lot of leeway given, especially if you're doing interesting things. I think that things are going to be really different. We have in the past year established a Department of Equity and Inclusion, which is about as Orwellian as it sounds, which wants to have oversight. They want to do curriculum reviews. And
to make sure you're being...
I think so. To make sure, again, they use these words, that it's equitable, that it's inclusive, which is whatever, we'll find out what that means.
So they haven't told you. They haven't said this is our definition of equity or this is our definition of inclusion. Or
I think that's what's going to be coming this year. I think because since we've been out, a lot of this has been developed and they're planning for it during the pandemic. I think we're going to really find out exactly what's in store for us. And based on the research I've done into what this department's planning, it's going to be about what we'd expect. So time will tell.
I've been doing research into different states and putting together slide decks for a group called Fair for All, and so that their chapters have something to use to figure out who do I contact and what's going on in my district. And New York in particular, we think of California, Oregon, and Washington State as being, hotbeds of this, and they are. But New York State has been, so far that I've seen, the most explicit with the wording of, the definitions of equity, diversity, and inclusion, with a framework they are using for culturally relevant, culturally responsive education, social emotional learning, all of it. And it is absolutely crystal clear, I think, even to the layperson. I mean, I went over it in a video on my channel, but I don't think it took a lot of explaining for the average person to read not even between the lines. It was right there. What they are doing is fundamentally different than anything we've done before. They are taking the critical theory lens and applying it to the entire curriculum across every subject, K through 12, actually preschool through 12, every phase, every stage of public education. This is going to be. And one thing they included that was new is that it was the job of the school to preserve and promote these marginalized culture, the cultures of origin.
Oh yeah.
Preserve and promote. Something that, first of all, I don't even think is desirable to a pluralistic society like ours. We've always been a melting pot where, if you wanted to preserve your culture in your home, with whatever you wanted to do, that was fine. But it wasn't ever considered something that the public sphere, that the government was there to do for you in any capacity. It was actually even sort of frowned upon a little bit, in the sense that, that would be balkanizing your own country, intentionally.
Correct. That's a tenet of culturally relevant pedagogy, is this idea that you kind of instill racial consciousness and uphold it among certain groups, as if racial consciousness will not bleed over into white students. They never consider that.
Yeah, that's not something I think we want to do.
No, it's not, and that's another concern of mine. They haven't considered the unintended consequences of this. Right. We're so caught up right now on these words, what is critical race theory? I almost, at this point, don't even want to use the word. I just want to talk about the ideas.
Exactly. Same.
I think a better way for people, if people want to understand what's going on, look at what's called critical pedagogy.
Yes.
Critical pedagogy is like the educational umbrella under which a lot of this occurs. And these terms are very ethereal. There's a lot of fluidity. There's no agreed upon definition. So I think when people, it's overwhelming. You try and even decode it. There's multiple definitions and crossover between different theories. But at this point, we're getting into these linguistic battles over, is it explicitly mentioned? It doesn't even matter. It's the ideas. And you see these ideas occurring in all areas of education.
Right. It's, are you for Western civilization and Enlightenment universalist values, where the individual is primary, and individual rights, individual, achievement, meritocracy, all of the things on which America was, founded and built. And the reason I believe, and probably you too, that we have been as strong and as, prosperous and peaceful as we have been relative to the rest of the world. Of course, we're not perfect, and we obviously could always improve. And we have done some things that, we shouldn't be proud of in the past. But again, looking at ourselves in the context of history, in the context of the rest of the world, I think we've got a lot to be proud of. And are we for that? And preserving that and protecting it and just continuing to make progress towards a better reflection of those values? Or do you want to completely burn that down, go with a collectivist, neo-Marxist, identity, sort of like tribal identity, ethnic identity, externalized self, that where your self is only the self in relation to the group? do we want to use critical thinking to criticize and have a Marxist view of critical thinking? Or do we want to have the Aristotelian version of critical thinking? And that's what, Jason Littlefield was on my channel yesterday and we did an interview and he had a great slide that broke it down just like that. On one side, you had one set of values, on another, you had the other side of values. And it's, which project would you like to work on, mom and dad? Okay. Because if you were sending your kids to school to work on this, stuff on the left of the slide, meaning, the Western Enlightenment stuff, the Western civilization values, that's not what they're doing. Increasingly, the focus is on the other side of the slide with this critical theory, critical pedagogy, neo-Marxist model where you're a destroyer. And I don't think that's hyperbolic. I really don't. I think, are you a builder? Are you a destroyer? They believe that you have to destroy. You have to become critically conscious of everything bad so that you'll have the motivation to tear it down and then constantly maintain this picture of utopia on the other side of that. That's the precursor to achieve it. You can't achieve utopia unless you burn down what you got. It's going to be, what we have is an impediment to achieving utopia. And then on the other side, you have people saying, well, first of all, utopia is a pipe dream. It's not possible because human beings are still human. And we all have the capacity for evil and meanness and cruelty inside of us. But these values bring out the best qualities. And so we can make more progress to a more perfect union than we have over here. But what you're angling for is like just chaos and war and, lunacy, in my opinion. Anyway, so I think those are the ideas as I see them breaking out. Jason was the one who kind of articulated that way. I'm just repeating what he said. But it worked for me. And that's what I've been trying to explain to parents is stop worrying about CRT specifically. I know it's kind of a attention grabber, but you could get rid of that and you'd still have a huge problem.
Oh, exactly. And I think it's naive somewhat to think that we can ban these ideas, that they're going to disappear. There's ideological capture amongst schools. You've got estimates of 92 to 97% of teachers identify as liberal progressive. And don't get me wrong, I don't want a school run of libertarians or conservatives. I want diversity of thought. I want there to be enough questions, a balance, a back and forth. We don't have that. And I greatly worry about, you said, the balkanization of society. What is it? Students already, Paul Rossi, said to me, he had a great way of saying it. He said, kids think in primary colors. Yep. And this is a really convenient way to think about things where you reduce everything to an issue of good and bad, oppressor and oppressed, black versus white. And that shapes how they see the world. That shapes how they think. That shapes their interactions. And when we saw violence last summer, whether it was Antifa, whether it was Black Lives Matter, right. I don't care if it was only 8%. It was enough to cause a significant amount of damage, a significant amount of upheaval. That's all it takes is, a minority. I guarantee you, every one of those people burning down buildings, tearing down statues, assaulting people, believed the tenets of wokeism.
Right.
Because it was an underlying justification. I don't think there was any person doing that says, yeah, actually, I'm skeptical about those ideas. Mm-mm. Those ideas were what enabled them to do terrible things. You cannot attack someone. You cannot destroy someone's property unless you believe that they are some sort of enemy, that they have it coming. And
that's part of what being human is. Jason was explaining that we have it sort of for a survival instinct, or our survival skills include the ability to be cruel and mean and vicious and all these things if we need to be. But another survival skill that humans have is a disinclination to do so. That because in order to survive as a species, we start off wanting to see the best in people, wanting to see good in people. And of course, the left right now is using that. They're using that good side of us and are, the tender-hearted people amongst us and things to build themselves up. But if you combine the two, you have something really dangerous. So if you manipulate people and take advantage of their desire to protect and do good, and you feed them a line that they need to be cruel. This is oh gosh, what is his name? The philosopher Marcuse. that we have to be intolerant to be tolerant. We can't tolerate different views that would, by his definition, be intolerant.
Mhm.
And those people need to be, we can't tolerate that. So it kills the heterodoxy.
Right.
It's
Right.
the antithesis of liberal thought.
Yeah, I think we have this kind of natural cognitive bias to project our own nature onto other people, and some of the the most radical people, and some of the people that are the true believers, we want to think, well, they're probably really good underneath it. They wouldn't really condone violence. They wouldn't really do these things. I thought that way for a while. I'm not so sure anymore.
Yeah.
I'm actually, I view this, as one of the big themes kind of my website, my kind of handle is that this is a religion.
Yeah.
Understand it in terms of zealotry, in
Yes.
terms of unwavering belief. I think what really shook me up about a year ago was when I saw teachers who were justifying violence against innocent people as some blood price that had to be paid. Innocent people that had nothing to do with it. Now, of course, it wasn't them. They were, safe in their condos or houses away from it. But whoever was on TV suffering was a cost.
Right.
And that is so against what we as teachers are supposed to teach. We teach about the Holocaust, and the Germans were placing a blame on Jews for everything under the sun, and they had to pay a blood price for these alleged sins.
Yeah.
That's what I saw. And these
and
are
now
teachers.
and they're doing it. They did it too with disease. They would put signs outside the ghettos saying, don't go in there, you'll catch a disease. And that would keep people away from seeing how they were treating people in the ghettos. So they added to the demonization that these people are carriers of a disease. And so when I see people even going so far as to use this virus, this pandemic, as another way to separate people into classes of people, the accepted, the not accepted, the good, the bad, as opposed to people making different risk reward assessments or having a different, healthcare need than you do, or whatever the case may be. It's no, you're good. I'm good. You're bad. And let me show you with my little thing that says I just got my vaccine. And I mean, so much of this is performative, which is what feels so much like a religion to me. And not to, denigrate people who are religious. I'm just saying that there is a ritualistic component to it. There's something very much about belonging and fellowship and showing the world I'm part of this. Look at me. I'm a good person. But it's the opposite. It's like everything they do is a projection.
Right.
Whatever they say you are, they are.
It's ironic too. It's not an inclusive religion.
No.
Despite all their talk about inclusion, they kind of hold up people as sacred, protected classes. These are the sacred, noble, downtrodden people, the chosen. If you're white, the best you can hope for is to be kind of in perpetual sin, but constantly groveling, self-flagellating. That is a never-ending path towards redemption that you'll never find. It'll never be enough. With our big religions that have survived for a reason. They're not perfect, but Christianity and even Islam have inclusive elements to them in terms of, an outsider can become one part of it. You may not agree with certain teachings of this religion or that religion, but you can still come to them. You can still be part of the group, and you can't really do that. There's ranks of classes within their religion of who's allowed, based on your level of holiness, who's allowed to say what, who's allowed to do what, who is truly saved and who is perpetual sinner.
I would say that the wokeism is of the traditional religions more like Islam, though, than Judeo-Christian values or beliefs, because for the simple fact that there is the component of submission.
Sure.
That sort of first you have to submit. It's like before you even believe, you have to submit to the belief system, and accept it as fact. And then we'll talk about whether you actually believe it later. And then the second thing is there's the political component. It is nearly impossible to separate Islam from politics in its true form. I mean, not to say that there are countries that haven't done it. Of course, there are Muslim countries, like, Dubai, for example, that it's an inclusive country, but it's a Muslim country. But there's political Islam that just like there's political wokeism. So you've got the value system that you're supposed to believe in, about who's a good person and who's not a good person and what's a sin and what's not a sin in the woke. And then you've got the political component of how you will vote and which policies you will support and what policies you will not support. And it's a very explicit list.
It's
And
theocratic.
it absolutely is. So, and there's no separation. Like you can't say, "Oh, I'm all with you on the social, cultural stuff, but I'm going to vote this other way." No, you have to accept the entire thing, hook, line, and sinker. If you were to say to somebody in the woke, like, "I'm down with the critical race theory thing, but I am against universal basic income, or I don't want Medicare for all," they'll just laugh you out of the room. They're like, "Well, then forget about it. You're not welcome here." You have to accept the whole thing. And that to me is more like fundamentalist Islam or Islamism, as some people call it, than it would be like, modern day Christianity or modern day Judaism. Even like Christianity and Judaism of the past still had the render unto Caesar concept of there's the secular world and there's, in the state, and then there's the religion, at least for the most part. And I wish we could get it classified as a religion because it would be easier to keep it out of the schools. Mm-hmm. But until then, I think it's important for parents to understand, like you said, stop worrying about what to call it. Think about the ideas and that it is a theocracy, like it's theological, minus the mysticism. So it's almost like if the mafia and Scientology had a baby. Like to me, that's what it feels like.
It's funny. We sometimes say that there isn't, there's not mysticism. There's not, well, it's more secular. And even that, I'm seeing that line blurred. And I see sometimes in their actions, their behaviors, there's symbolic sacredness to things that borders on supernatural spiritualism.
Well, you have that land acknowledgement. Don't forget. Right? It's like you're sitting on a piece of land.
Oh, sure.
I mean, it's like there seems to be, if you've got to have this moment of silence and reverence, then it's like you actually believe the long dead people are paying any attention to what you're doing. Like who's your audience here for this little moment of silence? And then the other thing they do is confession.
Sure.
There's a whole confessional component, which I think you're right. There's something a little mystical about who are you confessing to?
I think we're about 10 to 15 years, maybe sooner, away from people describing religious visitations from certain martyrs of this movement. I mean, I really do. I think there's going to be, at some point, there's going to be someone prominent who is going to talk about being visited by, the ghost of George Floyd and hearing a message from him. I think that is where it's going. I mean, look, we went so quickly. We went from thinking this was a relatively secular movement to a year ago. There were scenes out on the streets in public of white people on their knees washing the feet of black people.
I know, I've seen that.
This is, from an anthropological perspective, these are religiously symbolic things, clearly. I think, where does it go from here? I'm not convinced that it will not cross over into certain, not completely, but you will not have supernatural elements where people describe these things. Maybe that's just me being crazy. But I
think that's where heresy comes in my opinion. In the past, heresy didn't really come in when Christianity got strong. So it wasn't strong in the beginning, but then once it was strong, and it was like the state religion and so forth, then it was a while before vocal heretics were like, I mean, look how long it took for Martin Luther to come on the scene.
Sure.
I think we have an opportunity to, as you're doing, to be heretics much sooner and possibly prevent some of the worst of it. And I say that because I think there is something to the act of heresy against this kind of orthodoxy that damages it just enough. You kind of poke holes in it that it slows its momentum and it possibly will make it fall apart. So, for example, take the George Floyd thing you just talked about. Mm-hmm. Well, in their world, we paint murals and we worship. We was people who call for him to be made a saint and all kinds of things. In my world, I say he didn't deserve to die, but he was high on drugs and he assaulted a pregnant woman. He was a career criminal. He made bad choices, and no, he didn't deserve to die. And George, and Chauvin, there was justice in the court, but he is by no means worthy of worship. I mean, in other words, we tell the unvarnished truth about this individual and get back to first principles and facts. That like the fact is there's justice in America and it worked. And, here's how it worked. And, that we can all agree that we don't want people to be choked out or, held down and suffer in this way. Okay. We can all agree on that. But that does not elevate the individual who suffered to some kind of sainthood. He didn't make it occur. He didn't choose to be, like a symbol. He probably would prefer to be alive.
Sure.
And so I don't know. I think that there are too many people who are afraid to do that, who do like, you said a bad thing about George Floyd. I'm like, yes, and I'll do it again. And so should you. And I mean, that's not a bad thing. I'm just stating facts. He might have been a very nice guy, and I'm sure his family loved him, but he made these choices, and they did contribute. They were contributing factors to the situation he found himself in. And what we as a society should be concerned about is that situation shouldn't repeat in the technical sense and policing, and justice was served, and we need to move on and heal and whatever. Not that we should elevate him to some kind of sainthood.
Yeah, personality cults scare me for good reason.
Yeah.
I've really, one of my kind of personal political evolutions is even people that I have this instinct to want to kind of lionize and to look towards as heroes. I have to remember they're just people. And I think that's the difference between the left and whatever part I'm of. I don't know. Some people say I'm conservative. I don't really like to classify myself in those senses. I place priority and emphasis on values, not people. So to me, someone said, what are your political beliefs? I like to talk more in terms of the values, truth and justice, the things that are eternal. People are fallible. I've seen it with conservatives, even at times where they kind of want to uphold people to these positions. You have to say, just remember, they're just people. Right. They're trying to uphold the values you want, but they're not infallible. Right. This is true of anyone, any person. I think it's so important. But I think you're right. The left and the woke especially, they have this inclination, this need to create martyrs for their faith, because martyrs galvanize people. Right. And I think that's a great point. George Floyd didn't want to, lost in all this conversation is the man who did not want to be a martyr. It is almost as if, and I don't want to say that they want these things to happen, but I think when they do happen, there's almost this giddiness.
It's gross. You can feel it too. You can feel it.
Feel it too. Yeah. You can feel it coming, where they are just, here we go. Here's now our opportunity.
It does feel almost like, I understand. I don't agree necessarily, but I do understand the people who say, gosh, this is awfully convenient. You get these conspiracy theories of false flags and so forth. I don't think they are, but I do, but I do think the reason that's so believable is the way the media behaves. The way they immediately zoom in and create a whole narrative and chyrons and all that, it's like they make it the George Floyd death show. And so it's easier for people to start to think, it's almost like you choreographed this. It's almost like you've some screenplay writer wrote it, the way you're so quick on the draw with this.
Yeah. It's what's ironic is the other area where you see people do that a lot of is people that are racists. And they say, what do you mean? I say, well, here's an example. Someone, a young white girl is killed by a black man, and a racist will come in and they are almost giddy with excitement to be able to say, here we go. Here's our story. We'll make a martyr out of her. It proves everything we've said. That's the irony for me, is that they the woke share so much of the terrible qualities with the racists, with the white nationalists, the white supremacists, not in content, but in strategy, in tactics, and in logic. It's tragically ironic.
It's almost like my husband once said, he said, it's sort of what I wouldn't be surprised to find out someday it was this giant 4chan like trolling of the nation, like in other words, that,
Right.
like everything woke, and that like I absolutely believe Robin DiAngelo is a white supremacist, that she may not be aware of it. She may not like, it's not at some conscious level, but I think she instead of going to therapy, she wrote books,
Right.
like instead of coming to grips with her own personal problem of like, I really am afraid of and don't particularly understand and care for Black people. She's written these books and said and projected all this onto everybody who looks like her, and like, no, honey, we're not white supremacists like you are. Like,
Right.
maybe
I
you
don't.
are, but I'm not.
She's talking about these things, and she's like, "We've all been there," and I'm
They're
like,
like, no.
I don't know. Look, I don't think, there's some things I'm sure she says where everyone has of every skin color, people have thoughts. That doesn't mean you act or behave on them. People have natural biases and prejudices. That's part of being human. We all work against those. But you're right. When she says some of these things, like my first inclination, what I wanted to do, and I'm like, speak for yourself.
I know, right? And she won't tolerate that. I was like, no, you must be exactly like me, or else, here, let me throw a Kafka trap in your way. And and then I listen to some of the other things I say. Like, for example, if you are Black and you disagree with Robin DiAngelo, or you disagree with Ibram X. Kendi, they start hurling epithets at these people, like calling them. That's the surest sign to me, is watch how they treat somebody who is Black, who disagrees. You don't know what you're really thinking. You're just trying to appease, the white people. You're just this, you're just that. It's like, wow. Tell us how you really feel.
It's like, they're pawns. It's like the Soviets who, we represent the working people. We care about them so much. A working class person speaks against them and they execute them. Right. So much for being the party of the workers.
Exactly.
So,
exactly. And the same thing with, and BLM keeps changing their tune too. It's like, oh, we're, trained Marxists and we're for this, we're for that. And then people say, why didn't you give any of the money to the neighborhoods that were burned down by your protests? And suddenly there's like some reason why that was inappropriate. They were bailing people out. Somebody told me a story about a person's daughter that they knew who went to protest, and they're Hispanic, I think. And either Hispanic or mixed, I'm not really sure, but not Black, certainly not appearing Black, and not 100% African American. And she got arrested, and she went because she thought she was doing something good or whatever, and she got arrested. And an appeal was made by a member of her family to BLM for bail money, because they were bailing people out immediately. And they said, well, no, not her, because she's not Black. And the person making the appeal said, but she was there for your cause. And you're bailing people out. No, we're only bailing out the Black people who were there. And I was, and I'm like, okay, so much for like caring about the masses and the movement and all this other stuff. And it starts to feel, some people have described it as revenge racism or something along those lines. And well, obviously a grift and so forth. And so I feel like there are lots of different kinds of people, just as there were with organized religion. Mm-hmm. I'm sure we could agree there were people who were, Joan of Arc. And then you probably some archbishop somewhere going, give me some more women,
Right.
Here's my bag of gold. Go get my women.
What really disturbs me about this whole thing is their willingness to treat people as disposable and dispensable to the greater their cause or religion. I mean, when I saw it, there was a video that went out. He was a Black firefighter, and his bar was burnt down in Kenosha over.
Oh, I remember that. Yes,
I won't even go into that.
He just saved all the money. He just
saved all the money, and I remember just seeing him, a grown man cry on TV. I mean, my heart, you want to give this guy a hug, and asking, colleagues of mine about what they thought. It was just like, well, what do you want me to say? There was just this indifference. He had to pay the blood price of anger. And
got to break a few eggs to make an omelet,
Right. I mean, it could have been, it probably was, if anything, it was probably white Antifa radicals who burnt down his place. But because it didn't fit into their narrative, there was no sympathy. Or I'm sure he has insurance. He should get insurance as if it was his fault.
Well, never mind that. That shows a really disturbing level of misunderstanding about how insurance works. And, he had just opened the business. So whatever his policy, I'm sure it was enforced, but he hadn't built up enough time with the insurance company or anything like that. So even if they pay out on his policy, he's not getting another policy. So in other words, this idea that, well, you can pay it, you can rebuild, like, no, you can't, because in order to reopen a bar, you have to be insured. And if they pay out on a policy on a bar that was open for less than a week, and they got to give him, however much money, he'll just have to take that money and just put it back in his account to make up for his losses. But he won't be able to reopen without a policy. And now they'll be loath to issue the policy because his bar got burnt down.
Right.
It's like it might happen again. And often, too, in some policies, political violence is not even covered.
Mhm.
It's not even covered. So this idea, well, you have insurance. Like, yeah, if a fire randomly burnt it down, or there was a tornado or something that came through, act of God or whatever. But a bunch of people setting fire to my bar in the middle of a political protest, that may or may not be completely covered.
Well, the fact that you're thinking in this way and you're going through the thought processes and you're thinking about this person as a human reflects on your values and what's important to you. I mean, I'm starting to, at first I was kind of like, is he being fair when James Lindsay talked about psychopathy as being a characteristic of these people? Now I'm kind of leaning towards him and saying, these are, when you look at the psychological definition of psychopathy, some people in this movement really demonstrate it. And I think this movement serves as a magnet for people that on the edges of society are going to be drawn to this type of thing. It's like,
it was the same with Nazism. It was the same with Bolshevism.
Right.
All of those isms were possible. If you watch footage of, for example, like the Bolsheviks, and there's some remaining footage of them and how they behaved. If you read accounts of how they behaved, what happened to the kulaks, what happened to people even within the city, the bourgeoisie and so forth, how they treated people. People think it all happened in 1917. They just showed up and took over. No, for years they were doing things like bombing restaurants, just randomly, setting fire to businesses, or just going up and attacking people as they ate. And they were doing this for years. And they attracted people to their movement based on, are you a bully? Okay, you're hired. They would be welcome in that world, be rewarded for being a bully. And I say, look no further than what you see with, for example, trans ideologues. Okay. Who are obviously not everyone who's trans, but the ideologues, the ones who are out on social media and making demands and, all kinds of invading women's spaces and saying, we need to be led into prisons and all that. There is something really violent. I mean, J.K. Rowling was threatened with pipe bombs the other day because she just stated the truth about female physiology or whatever. So there's something violent, there's something anti-human, there's something psychopathic about this. And I think that's another part of the heresy I'm talking about, that we, in order to really push back against this orthodoxy, we have to just call it out every time. And as you said at the outset, I just decided I had to do something, that the cost of not doing something was greater than the cost of doing something, or at least your fear of it. And I feel the same way. That's why I have this channel. And I know I say things here that, I get comments in the comments, or people are like, you're a racist, or you're this, you're that. And I'm like, okay, well, that's your opinion, but I don't care. If you're entitled to say what you believe about me with impunity, you can say horrible things to me. You can call me names and or make threats against a major writer, J.K. Rowling. If you think you can do that and get away with it, you have enough privilege to do that. I certainly think I can use my free speech to say what I believe.
Sure. Absolutely.
I'm not attacking any individual. I'm not saying, all these people are bad people. I'm saying these ideas are really, really bad ideas, and they shouldn't be propagated, and they definitely shouldn't be taught to impressionable children, pre-literate, pre-rational children. Sure. I consider it to be abusive. Do you consider it to be child abuse to take ideas like this and teach them to young children before they can even read about them properly?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about abuse in terms of, psychological manipulation, which is what's occurring, I think instructing children in ideas, especially the younger you get, before they can really question them and they have the capacity to understand them and reason with them, I think there's an argument for that. Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't thought a lot about that, but yeah, I can definitely.
have a pretty broad definition, I guess, because in thinking about what you said before of how this is sort of a magnet for people who are sort of psychopathic or, have psychopathology, or sociopathology, certainly,
Sure.
then, you know, it's a magnet for cluster B personalities, what we call cluster B, like narcissism, not bipolar, sorry, borderline,
Sure.
histrionic, antisocial, these kind of cluster B personality types. And these are people who do not do empathy in the way, humans who function well and play well with others do. They don't
Sure.
see other people. And while I think I'm not a therapist, I'm not a doctor. I certainly can't comment from that position, but I do think when you take very young children, you can interfere with their development of empathy. If you get in
Oh, of
early enough,
course.
you can interfere with that, and you can cultivate their darker side, sort of Lord of the
Sure.
Flies side. We all have both, right? Each and every one of us has sort of the capacity for both, and it's just which ones are going to get rewarded. What are the incentives, and which are going to be discouraged and not rewarded, and then what are you going to end up with in 13 years' time? In terms of a person, is that going to be a person, as Jason said in the interview, he said, what do you want on the other end of this? Like, are your ideas conducive to inclusion and healing and, preventing trauma and, not being racist, like all the things that you claim you want?
Right.
Are these the behaviors that are going to get you there? Are these the lessons? You're an oppressor and you're the victim. Is that a lesson that gets you to a country that is that way?
Sure. I agree. I made like a little joke on Twitter. I said, if you think about these ideas and these approaches and these attitudes, apply them to your family. If you were to dwell on all the negative things people have constantly done, if you were to describe, mom's the oppressor, dad is the oppressor, how would your family life look like if you had no capacity for forgiveness, for understanding, for moving forward? Think of our nation as a family. Now, yeah.
I mean, it's a good way to bring it down to, your level, of your own life. So it's relatable. And I've asked that question many times. I've said, explain to me the mechanics of how this works, teacher who's for this. If you run across a teacher who's for it on Twitter, and they'll say, this makes the child aware, and we must make the children aware so that, they can improve society. And I've asked questions like, how though? Like, okay, let's go with your idea that making a young child, kindergarten, first grade, aware of all the terrible things that have happened in America with regard to racism, and that systems are systemically racist, stacked against them, the deck is stacked against them. Tell me how that translates in their young mind to the ability, never mind the desire, to improve the world as opposed to just go out and tear it apart. Because I don't think a kid has the capacity to envision all of the moving parts of society that they would have to work on to actually fix it. So I don't find it plausible that you think that's what's going to happen. I mean, explain how, and they never can. It just is. It just will. If everyone thinks this way, then things will be better. I'm like, but where are you getting that? Like, give me an example. Show me where in the world that has taken place. Rwanda? I don't see it.
Yeah, I don't think they've thought through a lot of these things. I don't think they've thought, considered unintended consequences. For them, intentions are everything. Well, we intend for it to be like this, therefore it will be, or therefore no harm can come from it. I'm looking at all the unintended consequences. You can have the best intentions in the world. It doesn't mean anything if your outcomes are terrible.
Right. Somebody made a point over here. I think this is kind of interesting. I want to talk about it. Mark says, I always ask people why they believe that racism is wrong, given that most humans throughout history did not believe it was wrong to believe in the superiority of their race, ethnic group, tribe. When they respond with, I feel, I say, I don't care how you feel. Why do you think it's wrong? Funny how they can't come up with anything that is not a product of Western philosophy. And it's really a good point, because the reason we understand it to be wrong, to be racist in the first place, is the very thing they want to tear apart and throw away.
Our individualist traditions, yeah.
Judeo-Christian values and, all of these Aristotelian kind of analysis of the world and all of these things, they want to just get rid of it. And that's why I say, they're just sort of racist dressed up for company. They are racists, but they're pretending they care about racism or pretending that it's bad. And I think his point is really well taken, that the reason they can't make any sense in the end is that they'd have to use the very thing they want to destroy to justify their own claim. And they don't want to do that.
And to bring this back, full circle where we started, with Jefferson and these ideas. I mean, where we are today would not be possible without Westernism, without Western civilization, without the words of Jefferson.
Yes.
I don't believe that. I mean, you look for examples. Mauritania, Northwest Africa, didn't end slavery until the 1980s. And their slavery was, despite they say, well, American slavery was unique and that it was based on race and skin color there too. It absolutely was. Mm-hmm. So yes, we dealt with the same evils as every other civilization, mm-hmm. and in a very terrible way.
Right.
But we laid the groundwork for a culture and systems and ideas that eventually overhauled it. And I'll add, overhauled it in a country where it was entrenched. That's what's very impressive. I mean, it's great for the European nations that have no slaves there to say, we're done with it. We'll abandon our but to do it where it was entrenched.
Yep.
Economically, socially, and to continue that struggle. I mean, the fact that we don't give ourselves credit or enough credit for that, it's just unbelievable. I mean, and from 1865, 150 years to go from this deeply entrenched old system in which, much of the world was participating, and then to have someone who descended from former slaves take the highest office of the nation as president, to diminish that and say that's not remarkable,
or even to say things like, well, they wanted to fight the revolution to keep slavery because slavery made America rich. Actually, no, it didn't. It did the opposite. It took getting rid of slavery to make the South remotely functional. They were a backwater, really. They were not. That part of why they lost the war is, the North had all the factories and they had all, but the vast majority, and you really can't grow. That's not a free market. That hurt every working class white person. Certainly not everybody owned a plantation and owned slaves. So your marketability, if you're white and have to get paid for your labor, is like nil. So you can't. What are you going to do? Right? They couldn't grow. They were going to stay trapped in that century indefinitely unless they got rid of slavery. That's not what made America rich at all.
Sure. Yeah.
And I just think, there are so many wrong ideas that are spit out like they're fact. Like everyone accepts this is true. And it's like, but it's not. And if you actually understood history, economics, or any of these subjects, you would understand how not true it is. So that's where I think you have the advantage in the sense that you have a background in history. So you're not a person who went to teachers college and decided to go teach social studies, right? You are actually an historian and you also have education background. So you've combined the two. I personally believe that's what all teachers should be. Yeah, I think that teachers should be more subject matter experts than they are.
It was the school where I went, I was lucky in that they really made, they required us to dual major in our content area and in education. It couldn't be an endorsement. It couldn't be a minor, which is what a lot of teachers, probably most teachers have. They have an endorsement, or they, or something unrelated. They, maybe majored in political science and are teaching history. I think we really need more more people who majored in history, teaching history.
Right. I think you should apply to be a peer reviewer for the Civic Secures Democracy Act grant proposals. I think you should. They're asking for peer reviewers. Oh, it is, I believe, a paid position. And one thing I've been trying to do on my channel is encourage people with your background and also your point of view to apply for one of those positions, because we need to have diverse viewpoints reading through those proposals before our tax dollars go out to teach civics and history to American students. Some people in the audience pointed out that Obama did actually not, he's not ADOS, he did not descend from slaves because although his father was Kenyan, his ancestors never were slaves in America.
Oh, that's okay. That's a good point. Yeah. I suppose what I would say is he was symbolic of someone who was part of a caste of people who would, if he was around back then, he would have been a slave, or even at a short time would have been a second-class citizen. So I think symbolically, that's a good point, though. Correct.
But actually, I look at it as even more remarkable in this sense. His background, in terms of his father being an avowed communist, his mother being a person of really questionable morals and values, and I mean, certainly some of the things that she did. The fact that he grew up in a Muslim household, and was fairly proud of that in terms of Indonesia and his stepfather and going to a Muslim school there. He did come back to the United States and live with his grandparents. He made no bones about his smoking pot. In other words, so here's a person who, in a post 9/11 world, is writing about growing up with a Muslim stepfather in a Muslim country, attending a Muslim school. He's half black. And by the way, the black half was a communist and all these things. And he still got elected. Not once, but twice. Yeah. And then even after, you could say, well, the first time they didn't know about Reverend Wright and his liberationist theology and the church he sat in for 25 years, which was so obviously racist, right? But everybody knew about it the second time. Right? We all knew about it the second time, and his excuses and his reasons. He did, though, say that he didn't agree with Reverend Wright, but it sort of wasn't really all that believable, because why do you sit in a church for 25 years if you don't agree, and give money to it and so forth? But he still got reelected.
Sure.
And, some people say, well, that's because John McCain messed up. But whatever you want to say, the fact is, never mind the fact that he was black. He had all these other things that I think one could argue, if we were the stereotypically racist, xenophobic, Islamophobic, whatever they want to say about the United States, there's no way he'd have gotten elected once.
Sure.
So I point to that.
They would say, I mean, that's a good point. They would say, though, in their theology, well, the good guys did it. That's the good, because they really divide America into the good guys and the bad guys. Yeah, so the people that didn't vote for him, or that didn't vote for him the second time, those were the bad guys. We were saved by the good guys, the woke. And that's how they view it.
Saved by the Frankfurt School. Really?
Saved. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm going to have to disagree with that. So, I mean, who was it? I think it was Bill Maher. And, every so often he says something astute. I don't agree with him most of the time. But he did one of his little new rule things, and it was about progressivophobia. He called it progressivophobia. And his definition was when you don't see progress. When you're acting like, it's just as bad as Jim Crow, if not worse, like Joe Biden is saying, the new voting laws are Jim Crow on steroids, or whatever he's saying. And it's, first of all, it's ridiculous, but he's not the only one. There are all kinds of people who are like, oh, it's so terrible. And so Bill Maher, to his credit, said, you have progressivophobia. How can you say things aren't better? And then he listed, including Barack Obama's election, but all kinds of other things that make it obvious that this systemically racist country's nonsense is just not true. And of course, Bill's a progressive and Bill's a Democrat, and he makes no bones about that. And I don't agree with him on so many things, but it was an important point to make that these are people rejecting reality, rejecting the truth that is right in front of your face. They're gaslighting millions and millions of people. And so I think it's great that you're doing what you're doing. I love the name of your brand, the heresy piece. I love the fact that you say that you're a heretic to the new orthodoxy. But I would encourage anybody watching to, follow Frank's example if you're not already. I know some of you in the audience already have your own channels, or you have your own platforms, and you are doing things. I see many people by name who are really engaged, making new curriculum. Michael Malioni, who's here, is doing math. And I know that Adrian has a channel, Sio Sophia. She's, blowing up the science thing and saying, we got to not do woke science. This is bad. So people are doing things, but I want to encourage anybody who's against this, use your voice any way you can. You don't have to have a YouTube channel. You don't have to have a Twitter feed. But if you have the opportunity to speak out, even in conversation with people you know, and you don't have to get into fights about it, just say, no, I reject this. And be confident in that, because I think that's what it's going to take is millions of individuals being what they would call heretical. I would just call logical, like
Right.
reasonable. Don't ever apologize for reason, right? I mean, that's what I see us doing is people sort of like cowering, like, well, maybe I'm wrong. No, you're not. Do you see them cowering and saying, maybe I'm wrong, as they say ridiculous things? Like, I'm sorry, little 5-year-old white boy, you're a racist. It's like completely ridiculous. So,
Right.
you've been so generous with your time. I don't want to hog up any more
Oh,
of it, but do you, what have we not covered that you think is important for people to know or think about or do, or how can we support you? How can parents support teachers like you who are still out there and still doing your thing?
I think finding them, that's going to be the challenge. When you have the opportunity, connect with them, offering them private support, even if they're not willing to come out yet. I think this is I started this 4 weeks ago, and it's kind of, ballooned very quickly. So I'm struggling to, where do I go with this? I think right now what we need to do is we need to start networking with each other, supporting each other. We don't want to, I'm not looking to compete with other people who want to do the same thing. I'm looking to uplift them, to promote them, to support them. We need to just get voices out there. If people want to come to me and they want to tell me their stories and have me go public with it, I'll do that. That's what I think this has to be about. It has to start kind of with a movement of ideas, of support.
Right.
And it's going to take some people like me and a few others, if they're out there and are willing to do it. I'd encourage them, because you can be a model of inspiration.
Right.
I
And
know it's hard. I know it's hard.
it is, and I know I make it sound like it's so easy. It's not so easy. But to your point, there are things you can do without being public. So, as you said, you can go anonymous and you can share things with people like me or Frank, who have platforms. But it's important to make sure people know you're out there. One of the ways these types of people gain strength and gain power is just silence. It's just, the old saying, right? All it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing.
Mhm.
And when I say we, I mean people who would like to preserve Western civilization, which is not a political point, by the way. That is the philosophical and a cultural value. You could be of any political persuasion, I would think. Well, I shouldn't say any. Probably hard pressed if you're a socialist, but you know what I'm saying? You could still be a centrist or a Democrat.
Sure.
You don't have to be a libertarian or Republican. You could be nothing. You could have no political home at all and still think these ideas are whack and I don't want anything to do with it. That's really the important thing. That's the important thing. And we are the majority. We who would like to keep on improving America as it is, and just keep moving forward with the model we have, are the majority. I firmly believe that.
Sure.
But we don't know that we are, because I think this is top down. You've got the academy, you've got journalism, you've got the current sitting president and his administration, and the Department of Education, the teachers unions, the largest, most populated states and their governments, and so on. So it feels overwhelming. And yet we're still the majority.
Right. And I think that's where, when teachers like me come out, it's important to, I'm not, maybe this will come in time. I'm not very comfortable self-promoting. I don't like saying, hey guys, share this,
Promote Frank,
tweet
promote
this.
Frank, promote Frank.
But when teachers like me or other people come out, we do need to amplify their voices,
Yes.
because then more people will say, oh, wait, I'm not the only teacher. Here's an example, or here's someone who's willing to speak out. And they might be able to do the same. And then all of a sudden, the little guy starts to look around and say, maybe I'm not so little after all. And so I hope over time, I don't know how long, it might take a year, 2 years, but we can start to build a movement,
Yes.
just of some resistance. some heterodoxy, some heresy.
Right. We just need to keep networking with each other and keep connecting. Like I said, so Frank has chalkboardheresy.com as his website. Your YouTube channel is by the same name, right? Chalkboard Heresy.
Yes. And I'm pretty active. I'm usually more active on Twitter.
On Twitter. Follow him.
Heresy.
Yep. Okay. CB Heresy on Twitter. And so you guys need to, promote this, follow him, et cetera. The more we get these things out there, the more people start to see them and they don't feel like, it's so dominated by the other message. And there is value in humor. There is value in just being ruthlessly honest. Like I said, you don't have to be mean. You just tell the truth. I mean, I can't tell you how many times Randy Weingarten has posted something I've said, no. You're like, no, she just put up something, but we need to, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, no.
Right.
Even something as simple as that. Put it this way. If you can't say no, you are not free. It comes down to that. If you can't say no, you're not free. So currently, you actually can say no. It's not yet Stalinist Soviet Union. It's not yet Hitler's Germany, right? We're not there. And the way we're going to never get there is to use it. Use the freedom that you have right now, because it's a lot harder to crack down as mercilessly as they would have to, right? Mm-hmm. On people who are using their freedoms than it is on people who are not, who are hiding and cowering in their homes and afraid to speak. And that's what they want. The people pushing these ideas want people scared. They want them wondering who agrees with me and who doesn't agree with me. Is it safe to speak or da, da, da. Assume it's not. Assume it's not. And then you don't have to worry about it. But also understand that you have as much right to speak and have an opinion as they do.
Right.
I mean, I'm making it sound simple because it is simple. Mm-hmm. And we have to have courage. If we don't have it now, we might not get a second chance, is kind of how I feel.
Agreed.
So,
agreed. It's now or never.
It really is. When I was a kid studying the Holocaust, I remember thinking, if I ever get to a point where I feel like I'm seeing things that are reminiscent, and please don't come at me with, you're comparing this to the Holocaust. No, I'm saying that I'm seeing this push towards collectivism, anti-individualism, a little weird, mystical, occult-like view of virtue and culture that is just a little too reminiscent of the run-up to a guy like Hitler. Okay. And I promised myself as a kid, if I ever did, I would be one of the people saying the emperor's naked. And that's that, come what may. I wasn't going to hide and hope it went away.
Yep.
Because I just didn't want to do that. I would rather take the consequences than live with the regret. Is my take. So I think we're in agreement. So everybody, This is Frank. This is Chalkboard Heresy. You've now met him. You know him. You know he is a fighter and very, very courageous. So
thank you.
Yay.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. Thank you for coming on and spending this time. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And we should do it again sometime. Whatever you want to talk, or just be like, hey, let's do it. I would love to get a panel together. I would love to pull a panel. I'm seeing Adrian's in there and Michael's in there. I think it'd be kind of neat to have a little panel of a few people with their with experience in different components of education. And I'd probably be on the fringe just being like, talk, but I think it's important. You get the science, the math, history. Right. These are really important disciplines that are under attack right now. So we should try to set something up. Let's try to set that up at some point. Okay.
Absolutely. Sounds great.
All right, great. And I'm going to get you that. And I'm going to put it in the comment section, you guys, the grant, the peer review thing. I'm going to get it to you as well, because I want everybody who feels as we do to apply to be a peer reviewer. If you have the background that you could do it, we need to have more voices in there reviewing these things. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks so much for coming, everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.